The engine of the golf cart hummed like a caged predator outside my barn. I could hear it over the low bleat of the goats and the occasional stomp of the horses, a sound that had become almost routine in the last week. At first, I thought it was a delivery, some maintenance guy from the HOA doing rounds. But the third time this week, I realized the pattern. It was always parked directly in front of my barn door, a metallic blockade against my very livelihood. I was in the middle of brushing Jasper, my 1,200-pound bull, when the latest intrusion occurred. His muscles rippled under my hands, his dark eyes calm yet intelligent, completely unaware of the petty human squabbles outside. I had half a mind to ignore it, but the golf cart had been there for 45 minutes now. 45 minutes that my feed deliveries couldn't get through, 45 minutes my sanity was stretched thin. The HOA president's son, a brat named Luke, had a grin that suggested he thought this was funny. I caught him once peeking through the barn windows, a camera dangling from his neck like some adolescent paparazzo. Every time I confronted him, he shrugged, smirked, and claimed innocence, though the cart said otherwise. I wasn't a violent man. I had never been violent. But Jasper had been restless, and I knew the creature could sense the irritation, the heat of my blood when someone crossed the line. Not today, I muttered under my breath, gripping the brush tighter. The sun was beginning to dip behind the distant pines, the amber light spilling across the barnyard and casting long shadows that made the ordinary look sinister. Shadows always had a way of exaggerating things, of turning harmless objects into threats. I squinted at the cart again. This wasn't the first time. It had been happening for weeks, but the audacity had grown. First, it was a single afternoon. Then, 2 days in a row. Now, it was almost like a siege. I thought about calling the HOA. But why? The president was his father. And the father, I knew from bitter experience, had a penchant for covering his family's tracks. The rules were their weapon, and I wasn't sure how to play in that arena anymore. I went back inside the barn to check the locks on Jasper's pen. The old wooden door creaked under my hand, a sound that echoed in the stillness. There was a peculiar scent, coppery, metallic. My heart rate picked up. I frowned. Blood? No, nothing. Just the faintest whiff of something out of place, like oil mixed with the earthy smell of manure. My eyes darted across the floor. Nothing was moved. Nothing broken. But I felt it, the weight of someone testing me. Testing my patience. I stepped outside, the board of the barn under my feet groaning with every movement. The golf cart glinted under the setting sun, parked at a deliberate angle that left no room to pass. Luke was nowhere in sight, but I knew he was somewhere, probably hidden, laughing at the tension he had created. I rounded the side of the barn, and my phone buzzed. A text from the delivery service, couldn't reach barn. Access blocked. I cursed under my breath, the sound sharp in the quiet. Jasper snorted, sensing my agitation, and nudged my shoulder with his massive head. I know, buddy. I know. For a brief moment, I thought about letting it go. Maybe this was just one of those HOA battles you endure until they tire themselves out. But as I looked at Jasper, I knew this wasn't about a petty squabble. It was about control. Luke wanted to assert dominance, to send a message. And the message was clear: this property, my life, was not fully mine. I walked toward the cart, hands flexing at my sides. No words were necessary, this was about action, not dialogue. But as I neared, a thought crossed my mind, one of those slow, creeping ideas that starts as a whisper and grows into a roar. What if Jasper could send the message instead? The barn door loomed behind me. The shadows of the trees stretched long, clawing across the yard like hands trying to pull me back. And then I saw it, a figure darting behind the neighbor's fence. Luke, small and smug in the fading light, waving his hand as if to taunt me. I froze for a second, my pulse spiking. My mind raced. What could I do? Call the police? Waste time explaining that the president's son was deliberately obstructing my property? They'd laugh me off, probably side with him, call it a misunderstanding. No, this required more subtlety, more precision. I needed to be smart, patient, controlled. I took a step back toward Jasper, feeling the cool evening air settle over the farm. The tension in the barnyard was thick, almost tangible. The problem was not Luke alone, it was what he represented, a threat lurking behind innocence, a daily reminder that I was being tested, pushed, provoked. And for once, I felt that patience, my usual shield, was not enough. As the last slivers of sunlight vanished, the first stars appearing like distant eyes in the sky, I made my decision. Tonight would not end in passive frustration. Tonight, I would prepare. Jasper sniffed the air, his massive body tense but calm. He trusted me, and I trusted him. I went inside the barn, shutting the door softly behind me. The dim lantern cast flickering light on the hay and the sturdy wooden beams. My mind was already running through possibilities, contingencies, strategies. Luke had started a game. And in this game, the stakes were no longer just inconvenience. They were personal. And I was done playing by their rules. The next morning, the farm smelled of dew and hay, but the air carried an undercurrent of menace. Even the chickens seemed to move with caution, their clucks low and suspicious. I hadn't slept well, my dreams were restless, filled with shadows of Luke's smirk and the gleam of that golf cart blocking my barn. I brewed a pot of coffee, the bitter aroma grounding me, and stared at the horizon where the first light burned the mist off the fields. I needed evidence. That was the first rule. Before I did anything rash, I had to know the scale of this harassment. Luke was bold, but boldness left traces. And I intended to find every one of them. I started with the cameras. I had a small array around the property, mostly for livestock monitoring, but enough to catch movement near the barn. As I flipped through the footage, my stomach sank. Luke wasn't acting alone. On one clip, taken late one night, a shadowy figure stood by the tree line, whispering into a phone, occasionally pointing toward the barn. I froze on the playback, rewinding and pausing frame by frame. The figure was deliberate in their movements, almost strategic. It wasn't just a teenager having fun. This was organized. I wrote down times, dates, patterns, connecting each intrusion like dots in a constellation. Monday, blocked entrance at 7:14 a.m., Tuesday, 2:05 p.m., Friday, 6:47 p.m. And always the golf cart, parked in a way that made leaving or entering the barn nearly impossible. My mind raced through possibilities. Who else was involved? And why? The quiet investigation quickly became personal. I remembered a neighbor mentioning that the HOA president had recently won a community leadership award, despite whispers of manipulation and favoritism. It clicked. This wasn't just a prank. It was intimidation, a warning veiled as bureaucracy. I decided to approach the problem methodically. First, I would document Luke's patterns in real time. I set up motion sensors along the barn's perimeter, discrete cameras hidden in hay bales, and a trapline of strategically placed lights that could be triggered remotely. It was almost military precision, but the stakes demanded it. By mid-afternoon, the first opportunity presented itself. The golf cart rolled into view, Luke perched atop it like a king surveying his domain. I stayed hidden behind the oak tree line, heart pounding but mind razor-sharp. I had the sensors ready, the cameras running. Every movement he made was being logged, every gesture recorded. Then came the whisper of tires on gravel. Another figure emerged from behind the cart. A woman, mid-30s, professional-looking, yet her actions were coordinated, almost rehearsed. She glanced around and gestured at Luke, who obeyed like a soldier receiving an order. I narrowed my eyes. This confirmed it, it was a conspiracy. The HOA president's son was not acting in isolation. I realized how deep this ran. My little property battle had escalated into something much larger, something methodical. I kept my distance, observing them from the shadows. They checked the barn door, looked over the fence, and then retreated as suddenly as they appeared. I waited 30 minutes, then approached the golf cart. There was a small envelope tucked under the seat, unnoticed by them. My pulse quickened. I retrieved it carefully, slipping it into my pocket like a detective snatching a vital clue. Back inside the barn, I opened the envelope. It contained photographs of my barn from multiple angles, some taken during the night, some during the day. There were notes, times, observations about when I was feeding Jasper, when deliveries arrived, when I left the property. Someone had been watching me closely, almost obsessively. I felt a chill. Whoever was behind this wasn't just after inconvenience. They were studying me, learning my routines, probing for weaknesses. And the fact that Luke had a partner only deepened the threat. I started connecting dots. The president's office emails leaked a hint, a recent property optimization project, supposedly to improve the community layout. On the surface, it sounded mundane. But when paired with the photos, the timings, the repeated intrusions, I saw the contours of something more sinister. Was my farm on their radar for acquisition, or worse? A lesson to others? I spent the next hour compiling everything into a digital folder, labeling dates, times, and the faces of the culprits. I didn't know who else was involved, but the pattern suggested more than two people. I realized I was in a quiet trap of my own devising. I was cataloging the enemy, but the enemy had no idea I was watching. The upper hand was mine for now, but I needed precision. Jasper nudged my shoulder as I reviewed the footage. His dark eyes seemed to ask what I planned to do next. The enormity of the situation weighed on me. This wasn't just harassment, it was surveillance, intimidation, and testing boundaries. One wrong move, and Luke's father's influence could turn the entire community against me. And yet, there was clarity in the threat. I knew exactly what needed to be done. It had to be smart, strategic, and above all, undeniable. No room for error, no room for hesitation. Luke had escalated the game, and I would escalate it further, but on my terms. By evening, the pattern had solidified. Weekday mornings, late afternoons, and Sundays at dusk were prime intrusion periods. I planned for each, anticipating moves, setting triggers. Every sensor, every camera, every light was a silent witness. Every detail would matter when the time came to confront them. And somewhere, deep in my gut, I knew that confrontation would be public. Luke and his accomplice had chosen my barn as their stage, but I intended to turn it into theirs. As the sun sank behind the trees, casting long shadows over the property, I stood at the edge of the barnyard, looking at Jasper. His breathing was steady, his body relaxed, yet I could sense his awareness. I whispered to him, almost a promise, soon, they'll understand the cost of trespassing. Soon, they'll see. The quiet of the farm was deceptive. Underneath the routine sounds, the rustle of hay, the low murmur of animals, danger was waiting. But so was justice. And I had the advantage of preparation. Tonight, I would rest. Tomorrow, the investigation would deepen, and the conspiracy would reveal more of its shape. One thing was certain, the threat was growing, but so was my resolve. The community meeting hall smelled of stale coffee and polished wood, the kind of scent that reminded you of bureaucratic power dressed up as civility. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, a podium at the front, a projector flickering to life with the HOA's logo. This was the stage. Luke had chosen to escalate, hosting a community discussion about property access and safety. Predictably, he assumed he controlled the narrative. Predictably, he was wrong. I sat near the back, Jasper's image etched in my mind as I surveyed the room. People filtered in, nodding politely, exchanging smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. I noticed the familiar, smug expression of the HOA president, Luke's father, perched at the front like a hawk in an office chair. He had no idea the trap I was preparing. The meeting started predictably, with the president droning on about community standards and respectful property use. Luke, sitting at the front beside his father, fidgeted like a cat who senses a storm. I felt the electricity in the room, tense, brittle. Then came my moment. I had uploaded all the footage, the photos, the notes into a discrete cloud folder and queued a presentation on my laptop. When I stood and requested a moment to speak, the room tensed. The president gave a polite nod, assuming it would be harmless commentary. He would soon regret it. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, voice steady, eyes scanning the room. "I have evidence of repeated harassment, surveillance, and intimidation against my property and my livelihood." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Luke's smirk faltered. I clicked the remote, and the first image appeared on the projector: the golf cart parked deliberately in front of my barn, timestamped, perfectly angled. The room shifted, a collective intake of breath. I advanced slide by slide, each more damning than the last. Photos of Luke sneaking around the barn, the shadowy accomplice on the treeline, timestamps aligning like a map of calculated intrusion. The whispers grew louder, the smug confidence in Luke's eyes dissolving. "You see," I continued, "this is not random. This is organized. And it has been happening for weeks. My animals' access to food, water, and safety has been repeatedly obstructed. This isn't about community rules. It's about control." Luke's father interjected, voice rising. "This is absurd. You're twisting normal community oversight into some personal vendetta." I turned to him, calm but piercing. "Look at the evidence, sir. Look at the dates. Look at the patterns. This is not a misunderstanding. This is deliberate harassment." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. A low rumble echoed from outside, followed by the sound of hooves. Heads turned toward the windows. From the barn, Jasper had been released. My careful planning had anticipated this exact moment. The massive bull, calm yet imposing, emerged from the shadows, his silhouette framed by the dusk light streaming through the hall windows. Murmurs escalated into gasps. Luke froze, pale. His accomplice attempted to retreat, but the doorways were blocked. "Stay calm," I called, though my voice carried over the rising panic. "He won't hurt anyone unless provoked." The visual impact was immediate. The room, once full of polite skepticism, now faced undeniable reality. My bull wasn't just a farm animal, he was a sentinel, a living symbol of the threat posed when boundaries were violated. Luke attempted to speak, stammering, It's just a..." I interrupted, clicking one final slide, the envelope with the photos, the detailed notes, every intrusion logged, every surveillance angle. "You see, Mr. Luke, your games end tonight. Not just because you've been caught, but because the consequences of your actions are visible to everyone here. Your father's influence cannot erase what you've done." The room erupted into a mixture of awe, fear, and whispered outrage. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to for years were leaning forward, anger mingled with disbelief. The HOA president's face went red, veins visible at his temples. He opened his mouth, likely to shout, but I held up my hand. "This is your accountability," I said. "Not a threat, not vengeance. Just the undeniable result of your actions." Luke, now realizing the magnitude of exposure, bolted for the door. His accomplice followed, but the combination of my positioning and Jasper's presence made retreat impossible without consequences. Security stepped in hastily, trying to regain control, but the visual had already done its work. The final slide lingered on the screen, a time-stamped overview of the last 3 weeks of harassment, each moment impossible to deny. People were talking in low, urgent tones, neighbors exchanging shocked looks. The president's authority had fractured in an instant. I stepped back from the podium, letting the murmurs grow into a tide. Justice, or at least exposure, had its own weight. The bull's massive form shifted slightly, a calm yet imposing reminder that the threat was real, deliberate, and now public. As the crowd slowly settled, whispers and questions still flying, I realized something important. This was only the beginning. Luke and his accomplice had been forced into retreat, but the deeper network, the motivations, the backing, remained hidden. I had won the moment, but the war was far from over. Jasper returned to the barnyard as quietly as he had arrived, his presence leaving a lingering sense of awe. I watched him, feeling the rush of vindication, yet aware of the subtle tension in the room. Even now, the undercurrent of danger hadn't disappeared. It had simply shifted, moving into shadows deeper than before. And as the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, I caught a glance from across the room, a flicker of recognition in Luke's eyes, a silent acknowledgement that this confrontation had not erased the threat entirely. The showdown had ended. The evidence had spoken. But the bigger game, the one behind the harassment and intimidation, was still out there, lurking. Waiting. And I would be ready. The morning after the showdown, the farm felt eerily quiet. Birds called softly, dew sparkled on the grass, and the sun painted long shadows across the barnyard. Everything appeared normal, almost too normal. I sipped my coffee on the porch, the mug warming my hands as I watched Jasper chew lazily on hay, his massive head swinging with casual authority. He seemed unconcerned, the storm behind us irrelevant to his world of feed, shelter, and routine. But I knew better. While Luke had been exposed, the HOA president had withdrawn quietly into his office, fuming, plotting. The power dynamics had shifted, yes, but some threats lingered like smoke in the corners of a room. Victory had been public, undeniable, but subtle danger was a patient adversary. Neighbors came by later in the morning, curious, apologetic, supportive. Mrs. Thompson from down the lane brought a plate of cookies and a sheepish smile. "I had no idea," she said softly. "We all thought it was, well, just neighborhood squabbling." I nodded, accepting the gesture, but my mind wasn't on cookies. I was cataloging every look, every conversation, every hint of alliance. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. The HOA president's influence might have been checked, but it had not been eliminated. "I hope he learns his lesson," one neighbor muttered, gesturing toward the distant treeline where Luke had fled. "I doubt he will," I replied, voice calm but firm. "But at least everyone knows the truth now." Inside the barn, Jasper seemed to sense the tension still lingering in the air. He nudged my shoulder, heavy but gentle, a reminder of the strength and loyalty that had carried us through the confrontation. I stroked his coat, feeling the warmth and power beneath my hand, thinking about how careful planning and calm determination had turned chaos into control. By mid-afternoon, I returned to my investigation notes, reviewing every timestamp, photo, and motion sensor log. Even though the showdown had gone perfectly, I knew the importance of vigilance. Every detail mattered. One slip, one oversight, and the adversary could re-emerge with a vengeance. The files were organized, labeled meticulously, a blueprint of the conflict that had unfolded. I walked the property perimeter, checking the fences, the barn doors, the small cameras still humming softly at their posts. Everything was in place. Everything was secure. Yet, a subtle sense of unease remained. The threats that had manifested so visibly, Luke, the accomplice, were gone for now. But the shadows hinted at someone higher, someone more patient, who had orchestrated events behind the scenes. Late in the evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned a bruised purple, my phone buzzed. A notification from a news outlet, the community meeting, the exposure of harassment, the evidence of intimidation, everything had gone viral in the neighborhood network. The story framed me as the brave property owner standing up to petty tyranny. I felt a surge of relief, followed quickly by a sobering thought. Public validation was temporary. What mattered was control over my own property, over my own life. And as long as there were those willing to manipulate from the shadows, vigilance was the only shield. Jasper grazed near the barn as I tidied up the yard. The soft clink of water in his trough was the only sound breaking the silence. I paused, watching him, thinking about how much trust he placed in me. It was a reminder that sometimes, the fiercest battles were not won with anger or force, but with patience, strategy, and subtle execution. That night, after locking the barn and double-checking the gates, I stepped onto the porch, looking out over the fields bathed in moonlight. Everything seemed peaceful. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of hay and earth. But I noticed something, a flash of movement across the far field, too brief to identify, almost like a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze. Heart rate quickened. The previous weeks of surveillance, harassment, and planning had taught me to recognize the faintest ripple of danger. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Someone or something was watching. I didn't panic. Instead, I felt the calm focus that had guided me through every confrontation. The lesson of Luke in the golf cart was clear: patience, preparation, and strategic action were everything. Whoever remained in the shadows would learn that lesson too, in time. Inside the house, I reviewed the footage from the day's security sweep. Nothing definitive appeared, just subtle shadows at the edge of the camera's range. Still, the sense of observation persisted. It was the chilling reality that victory could be public, but the game behind the scenes never truly ended. I glanced at Jasper, sleeping now in the barn, the quiet rumble of his breathing steady. My companion, my protector, my reminder of why boundaries mattered. I placed a hand on the railing, feeling the rough wood beneath my fingers, and made a silent promise: we would be ready. Always ready. And then, as the night deepened, I noticed a single envelope tucked into the mailbox at the edge of the property. No markings, no return address. Just a faint, deliberate wait, a whisper of warning: this isn't over. I held it up to the porch light. The paper was thick, heavy, professional. Inside, a single photograph: my barn, my property, taken from the air, perfectly centered, timestamped just that evening. Someone had been there. Watching. Waiting. A chill ran down my spine, but I smiled. This time, I was prepared. And next time, the shadow wouldn't see what hid it coming. The quiet of the farm returned, but beneath it, a pulse of anticipation remained. The community was safe, for now. Jasper was calm. I was ready. But the bigger enemy, patient and methodical, still lingered in the dark. And when they made their next move, they would find me waiting,